Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to Reading Aristotle's Politics. Today we're continuing our examination of Book 7, Book 7 and 8. Book 7 and 8 are so-called the best regime, his account of the regime, and by the best regime, this is the regime that one would pray for. In other words, this is not the regime of practice, not the regime that is best in a particular situation, but the regime that we would pray for, right? That is the idea here. Last chapter, we introduced the introduction of it and talked about the question of, before we can answer the question of the best regime, we have to answer the question of the best way of life. And therefore, he points to his discussion in the ethics and the way of life this, of happiness, of virtue, right? This way of life of virtue. Now we're turning to chapter 2, which we will continue this thing here. And he's talking about happiness, right? Whether happiness must be asserted to be the same both for the single individual human being and for the city, or not the same, however, remains to be spoken of. So the question is the question of happiness, the happiness of the human being, for the human being, and the happiness of the city, is it the same or not? This is the question that's going to be addressed in this part here. But this too is evident, right? So therefore, this is. I think this is an assertion. This is an assertion. All would agree it's the same. This is kind of an assertion. Well, if it's a question, why is? In other words, shouldn't we get an argument here? I mean, this is what I think. So let's see what happens. We're getting the positive argument here, right? This is the positive argument, but maybe there's a negative argument too. So just keep that in mind. So, and let me suggest something else here. Book 7 and 8, and particularly about the account of the best regime, should be taken kind of like a test to see if we've been paying attention to what he's talked about. Now the question here is whether this is the famous question. 7 and 8 is should it come after book 3 or does it come after 4, 5, and 6? This is that problem because the ending of book 3, last chapter of book 3, has the ending that leads us directly to book the first chapter in book 7. That's the so-called tradition, the so-called ordering question, right? So maybe if we, in other words, there's two questions. Did the lessons of 4, 5? I mean, did the lessons of 1, 2, and 3 hold us bare? In other words, did we understand what was going on here? And what is going to be argued here is kind of maybe being a test. It's like, and it echoes what my teacher Leopold de Alva always said about the Prince, the last the last part of the Prince, the 5 last from the last part of the Prince, which dealt with this chapters 22, 25 of the Prince, which where he there is testing the reader whether they paid attention, and where he makes assertions which he's earlier said would be bad, and therefore this is a kind of argument. And I'm going to make an argument here that Aristotle's kind of, no, he's not. Of course, Aristotle's coming significantly later, 1400 years later, 1500 years later, right? So it's not like Aristotle's so Machiavellian followed him, but there's something similar going on here in that sense. There is this kind of, and the discussion of this regime that we pray for, he will say things that he's kind of warned against, particularly in book 1, 2, and 2, particularly in book 3. So this should raise eyebrows, right? This should raise rather eyebrows. That, well, he said what he's advocating here or asserting here in these chapters on the best regime that we would pray for, particularly on the discussion of the regime before we get to the discussion of education, but the discussion of this best regime, we get there is kind of a sense that Aristotle is testing us, right? Have we been paying attention? Like this, have we been good students and followed his things, or are we just did we miss it? And this is Alvarez calls the section "Prudence in the Prince," in his arguing chapter 2025 is this discussion of the prudence of the prince, and it's the testing of the prudence or judgment of the reader, right? Whether you're paying attention. Well, I think there is something similar going on here, and I'm going to argue all through this discussion of there. We should always take what he's saying not as simply to be assertion, but testing whether we've understood what he's said before, and if there's a contradiction, when there's a contradiction. Now, it's not going to come up right here, but it's what's important about this. We get the discussion of happiness here, which is very interesting. Where we get the argument is that, well, of course it is. The answer is that a question is asserted, but a question is raised that we have to address, but then an answer is immediately given, which, of course it is. It's simply so all would agree it is the same. For those who ascribe living well to wealth, in the case of a single person, also calls the city as a whole blessed if it is wealthy. Those who hold honor, those who honor the tyrannical way of life would assert also above all, right, tyrannical above all, would also assert that the city is happiness, which rules the greatest number of persons, right? And if anyone accepts that the individual is happy on account of virtue, he will also assert that the most serious city, excellent again, the most serious city is the one that is happier, right? So therefore, there's this kind of argument but is that really the argument of the individual? In other words, he's saying that there's this, that various individuals will make claims about the best city, how the city should rule. So yes, yeah, and that's true. He said that in book 3, that the regimes are going to be the claims. The different regimes will arise out of the particular individual's view of justice. And they're going to be, each type of regime is going to advocate a certain type of justice, a certain way of life, a certain understanding of there. So yeah, there is a connection here between the people and the individuals and their view of justice, right? But again, but he didn't answer. He's not really answering the question, is he? That is the happiness of, in other words, yes, there's an assertion being made by the partisans that there is, in a sense, that the view of a partisan asserts that that their view should be the best way of life, right? So therefore, what is best for their understanding of themselves and the society is a claim of the partisan, the political actor. But the question is this true? Is it true? Is the good, the what is best for the individual is also best for the city, the political community? Okay, is it identical, or is something maybe possible for individuals that may not be possible for an aggregation? Okay, an aggregated unit. So therefore, so he gives an argument. Yes, it's obvious, but then the obviousness is, and he gives the evidence of the various claims made by the various partisans towards the different types of viewing of justice. Right, that the tyrant think the tyrannical way of life is best. The 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 wealthy believes the wealthy way of life is the oligarch or the wealth, those who love wealth, and the aristocrat, those who love virtue, those who have virtue and love virtue, will argue that the way of virtue is best. Right? That's a truism. But does this answer really answer the question he's asked? I'm not convinced in that sense. But the following two things are needed. But the following two things are in need of investigation. Okay, this is his raising up. One, which is the most choice-worthy way of life? Okay, that which involves engaging jointly in politics and sharing in the city, or rather that characteristic of the foreigner and divorced from political community. So, which way of life is better? Is it the one of the engaged person and those involved in political life, or someone who is just foreigner, stranger, right, and divorced from political community? And further, which regime and which state of the city, condition of the city, are to be regarded as best, regardless of whether sharing in the city is choice-worthy for all or only for most, and not for certain persons. So, in other words, okay, the first question is about whether the best way of life is political life or something like the strange or the individual. Okay, is this the same? And then what is the best regime? Okay, regardless of the answer we give above, we're separating these questions. That this the answer to the second does not depend the answer to the first. Okay, so that's interesting in that sense. So we have certain problems here because if it is connected, then that's another issue. But if it's not connected, then we get a question. Then could the best way of life be if the best way of life is for people is not really the political life, but rather the life of philosophy, right? The philosopher, the contemplative person, Socrates, who shuns the political because the political life is unjust, right? The famous line that Socrates argues in the Apology that a just man or a good man, if he tried acting in the city, to Athens or most cities, he would be condemned, right? That's why he left. He mostly kept to himself and did not, and only did what the law required of him to do, right? Um, well, that's something to think about in that sense here, right? So let's continue. Um, since this, but not what is choice worthy for the individual, is the task of political thought. In other words, this question, these two questions, this here is the following two questions: What is the best way of life? Okay, and which regime and what condition of the city are considered best, right? Okay, this is the question, but not what is choice worthy for the individual. So wait a minute, it's not what's choice worthy. He says the political thought, the concern for political thought and study, is not about what's choice worthy for the individual. It's rather what is best for the city. What is the most choice worthy way of life for the political. But that seems to contradict the first point that they're the same, right? So, okay, we're seeing that. So let's continue where we left off. The task of this is study. And since at the present we have intentionally chosen to limit ourselves to this sort of investigation, the former is incidental to the latter, a task to the latter, a task for this inquiry. The former is incidental to the latter, a task for this inquiry. So therefore, this investigation, these two things, the former is what? Incidental. This is the key things. Uh, um, um, the latter is a task is a task for this inquiry. I think there's something missing here. I think this is the very interesting point here. So therefore, the question is whether what regime is and what state of the city is regarded as best, right? But this is incidental. That's intentional. In other words, um, the former is incidental to the latter. Okay. Now he says that the best regime must necessarily be an arrangement under under which everyone might act in the best manner and live blessedly is evident. In other words, now let's go to I think book note 7. Hold on. Yeah, the Makoyos, blessed as synonym for happy, right? Blessed. Um, the form Rava carries a strong religious connotation, right? Heroes were said to go to the island of the blessed after death. So this idea of there's something divine about this, the blessed. It is tied to happiness, but it's tied to this kind of divine quality. So the best the best regime must necessarily be that arrangement, right? The arrangement, political arrangement, in which anyone might act in the best manner and live. In other words, that anyone would act in the best manner and live blessedly. Now, this is evident, right? So, therefore, this is a very interesting question. The best is a place where an arrangement under which anyone might act in the best Aristotle's manner and live blessedly, right? Yet there is a dispute among, now, okay, this is the assertion. Now we get to a question. Yet there's a dispute among those who agree that the most choice-worthy way of life is that accompanied by virtue, as to whether the political and active way of life is choice-worthy, or that which is divorced from all external things, that involving some sort of study, for example, which is which some assert is only philosophic way of life. Right? This is that famous dispute. In other words, the question is that he says for the debate of the proponent of the political and philosophical life, you see the famous discussion in Gorgias, right? Plato's Gorgias. Um, Now, this is important. This debate. This question is which way of life is better? Is it the political way of life or the philosophic way of life? And that the philosophic way of life is divorced from all external things. It's only internally the truth, the divine. Um, okay, so therefore the question if what is virtue? Is virtue aimed at this action in our man's interactions and character and the living in the world and political life, or is the virtue seeking is that of the intellect of the mind, that which seeks the highest and the most true sense, the complete, this divine of the whole, the cosmos. Okay, the philosophic is love of wisdom, and wisdom is not only wisdom of that, it's the wisdom of the whole, the cosmos. So. Okay, we have a dispute here. The question, what is this way? And there's a dispute about what is a choice-worthy way of life. The question is, what way of life is more choice-worthy? The dispute here is between the philosophic way and the a political way. Okay, now, okay, some people may argue that this whole argument. Some people argue that the philosophic way is only open to the few, whereas all people can engage in some level of the political. So therefore, only the few and the best can ever have the philosophic way of life, whereas the greater sort of people can achieve philosophy. And since we're talking about the city, this is not the city is the aggregate of all the people. Therefore, maybe the argument is that the city cannot achieve the philosophic way of life, and any attempt to achieve the philosophic way of life would have to exclude a lot of people. Okay. So that's kind of an interesting point there, but let's think about this. For it is evident that these two ways of life are the ones intentionally chosen by those human beings who are the most ambitious with a view of virtue, both in former times and the present. The two, I mean, are the political and the philosophic. So these are the most ambitious. The political types, the ambitious political man, and the philosophic. These are the ambitious, those who seek virtue. There's two different views of virtue. That is philosophic virtue or political virtue. Okay. It makes no small difference on which side the truth lies. For a sensible person, at any rate, must necessarily organize matter with a view to the better aim, both in the case of human beings individually and for the regime in common. Okay, so not only what is the case for us individually and what is for the best in common. We must make it. In other words, this is again, all sensible persons, at any rate, must organize matters with a view to the better aim. Right? What is the better aim? Both in the case of the individual and the again. But remember, he said again earlier, he kind of suggested that wait a minute, for political things, we should be taking the latter, concerned ourselves not with the former, but the latter, right? Not with the regime for the regime in common, and not so much for of human beings individually, right? But since but the thing in common is a collection, an aggregation of individuals, So maybe we can't escape the discussion of the individual thing. But again, individually, there's going to be a big difference because only the few will be truly capable of virtue in that, and others will not. But therefore, that won't be a common anymore, right? They won't have the ones who are not able to exercise the virtue of the mind and live the philosophic way of life aren't going to be have anything in common or have that in common with that. They will be the question then becomes they're no longer political, in that they're no longer ruler and ruled, rather they become ruler and ruled. In other words, the ones who are capable of it become the rulers, and those who are not capable. This reverts us to the situation of mastery that is raised in Book 1 about the problem of the rule of the foresighted over the lack of foresighted, right? In Book 1, Chapter 2, right, of the politics. So let's continue. There are some who consider rule over one's neighbors, if undertaken after the fashion of a master, to be accompanied by injustice of the greatest sort, and if in a political fashion, not to involve injustice, but to be an impediment to only one's well-being. Okay, so therefore, wait a minute. It's something interesting he says that if I rule like a master, this is going to be unjust. In other words, the rule of the master is to rule despotically. In other words, to not to rule not over free people, but unfree people. Okay, rule through coercion, to master, right? And therefore, there is something. If you're going to rule your neighbors in a masterly fashion, there is this is accompanied by injustice of the greatest sort. And if in a political fashion, not not to involve injustice, but only to be an impotent. It's not injustice. No injustice is going to be done, but it's going to be a blockage of your own well-being. In other words, you might not be able to as be able to engage in philosophy and to fulfill your truth capacity to be one who's able to live the philosophic life. And so it's impotent. In other words, it doesn't impose injustice. It's not an injustice. It's just the block impediment, right? Others hold the opinion that are virtually opposite to these. They believe that the active and political way of life is the only one for man, and that in each case, in the case of each sort of virtue, there is no more room for action uh, on the part of private individuals than on the part of those who are active in respect to common matters and engage in politics. Now, that is the real man, the ander, right? The ander. This is that, right? A strong connotation of maleness or manliness, right? This is that very, you know, so that for a man, a manly man, right? Ander, right? And that's not. In other words, this is the opposite here. This is the alternative view. That the first one that master, this the first view is this that okay, those who consider rule over neighbor if taken in a fashion of master is the greatest injustice. Well, but if in a political fashion, well, it's an inconvenience, right? It makes it difficult for you to be the good man, right? It puts impediments. He has to rule instead of caring about the best things. He has to inconvenience himself, right? But now this other view is that that virtue only really means this, right? That those believe the active way of life and the political way of life is the only one for and this is echoing of what the Gorgias, Plato's Gorgias, where the dispute between Callicles and Socrates, right? Um, and then those of the part who are active in respect to common matters and engage in politics. This is the conception some of them have, right? But others assert that the mode of regime involving mastery and tyranny is the only happy one. So therefore, those who argue that the only happy regime is those involving mastery and tyranny. So therefore, wait a minute. But is the political person arguing that? So the two arguments that were just dealt with here don't are it's not a tyrannical argument. That this argument here sounds like no. Some people say that the active life is this, and therefore this idea seems to lead to the tyrannical argument, but it doesn't necessarily have to, because the tyrannical argument assumes that the tyrannical argument does not rule. It believes that all rules masterly rule, right? All rules masterly rule, and that is problematic, right? That is tyrannical, right? But that's not. And what he said is, and he's denied. Plato denies that the tyrant is happy, and even Aristotle kind of hints that he's not the tyrant is not going to happy in various parts. No, in fact, tyranny is always seen as a unjust rule, and how could something unjust and full of vice and vicious be happy? Okay, this is not going to be the happy life. This is whoever searched this is wrong in that sense, right? Indeed, in some cities, this is the defining principle of the regime and the laws. They exercise mastery over their neighbors. So therefore, wait a minute, the regime that a mastery over their neighbors. But is this just? There is something right here that there's some. In other words, that little line up here, there's something that those who rule over their neighbors in a masterly fashion are engaging in injustice. This is the problem. There is engaging in injustice here. The question is, or is all rule masterly? Okay, this is another thing. I think this is the problem here. And again, remember what he said all the way back in Politics 1, Chapter 1, that Aristotle thinks that there is fundamentally a distinction between the master, the politikos, the basileus, and the oikonomikos, the household manager. They're not the same. They don't do the same thing. They're different in kind, right? Not just different in size, but different in kind. And therefore, the despotikos, the masterly, the rule of the masterly thing, is not the same as politikos, the one who engages in political rule. So this is what this is why there's a problem here. This argument is that they exercise mastery of their neighbors. Hence, while most of usages existing among most cities are, so to speak, a mere jumble. Nevertheless, if the laws anywhere look to one thing, it is domination that all of them aim at. So, therefore, in other words, the laws aim at rule, the domination, he says. Domination is very interesting. That the laws all aim at domination, all the rules of these things. The rules, in other words, usages among the cities are, so to speak, a jumble, right? Nevertheless, if the laws anywhere look to one thing, it is domination. In Sparta, in Crete, for example, it is with a view to war that education, the greatest part of the laws, are organized. But yeah, but isn't this a problem? Isn't that maybe that is because the people the regime is shaped by the warlike? So is the thematic really the this seems to be the argument, thematic, right? The thematic, the warrior, those who are ambitious, those who have thumos, those who are going to, but is politics merely the thematic? Okay, and that's the question: is political rule just merely thematic rule and akin to mastery, or is something else going on here? So let's think about this. He says that the education of Crete and Sparta focuses on the wars, right? And this is footnote 10. He goes, enemies, right? To tapa instead of taos polemos, perhaps rightly. So they're the enemies, right? So someone maybe even say that we viewed to enemies. This is even interesting. Another way you can read this line is it is a view to enemies, right? That education and the greatest part of the laws are organized. And that may be true too. In other words, this is okay. That is that little weird thing in the text. If we read it as laws, then we see the war as thematic. But the problem is maybe that the political life deals with safety, right? That's the Hobbesian position, the enemy. Schmidt, right? The idea we have to deal with the enemy. The enemy is the threat to in other words, the threat to our safety, the threat to our lives, the threat to our security and our safety. That the political deals at this level of necessity. This first thing is our safety. In other words, remember that you can't have the best. That as Book 3 he argued, it's not just mere life, but the best way of life. Living well, not just living, but living well is the goal of political life, the political community. But the problem is, living is a precondition, as he talked about earlier. In other words, that yes, the soul is the highest thing, but I'm sorry, life and also instruments are preconditions for virtue. Okay, if you don't have health and material goods, it's going to be hard to be virtuous. Okay, likewise, if you don't have life, it's going to be impossible. Life and security, it's not going to be impossible to be happy in that sense. Okay, so therefore, this is what he's saying here about. I think we have to understand this like here. So therefore, create with a view to wars or enemies, that education and the greatest part of his laws are organized, right, to dealing with others. Further, among all nations. Now, this is interesting. Now, he doesn't speak of policies. He does take ethnoi. He does have this word ethnoi here, nations or tribes, right? Among all ethnoi that are capable of aggrandizing self, power of this sort is honored. So they're the people of peoples who are capable of aggrandizing themselves. Power of this sort is honored. Domination is honored, right? For example, among the Thessian, the Persians, the Thracians, and the Celts. So maybe this is actually an interesting point that the type of people you have, may shape the kind of regime that you may have to do. And that certain people are warlike, and their warlike nature will lead, and they will seek their warlike nature, the contentious spirit will lead them to conquer, to seek domination as the highest life. And others will not. Okay, among some of them, there are also certain laws stimulating men to this sort of virtue. For example, Carthage, right? Carthaginian. In other words, that among some of them, right, there are certain laws that have to encourage men. So it is asserted that they receive armlets to adorn themselves for each campaign they go on. In other words, they reward them, they make them honor them. I think there was once a law in Macedonia as well, as that any man who had not killed an enemy had to wear a tether for a belt. Among the Scythians, one who had not killed an enemy was not permitted to drink from the cup passed around in a banquet. Among the Iberians, a warlike nation, they fixed in the ground around a tomb that many spits as a number of enemies they had killed. Okay? And there are many other things of this sort among the peoples, the nations, right? Some of them prescribed by laws, others by custom. So we get this idea that the people, there's something about this ethnoi, the people, the type of people, the type of people, ethnic people, the ethnoi, the nation. What is their characteristic? What is their nature? What is their character? Are they warlike? Of warlike peoples, they're going to overstress this thing, and they're going to have these customs, both by law, prescriptive, both in law and custom, right? The nomos, the double aspects of law. Yet it may perhaps seem absurd to those wishing to investigate the matter that this should be the function of the one expert in politics, to be able to discern how to exercise rule and mastery over those nearby, whether they wish it or not. In other words, and I think this is the thing. I think this is the problem: is that this is not politics. In other words, it is absurd because politics is about, in one sense, those who live a common life, those who are sharing and living a common life, and living it deliberatively, right? This is this idea of citizenship. The political is sharing a free people, the free people who are not slaves, but who are fellow citizens, fellows, common people. And therefore, you're ruling over free people. and there's kind of a consent. There is kind of like this idea of you rule over them willingly. They do want to be, in other words, they willingly accept this rule. In that sense, they accept the rule of this because it's beneficial. They share it. This is the koinonia. They share in the benefit, the common benefit. All those who are in the community benefit from the rule. So therefore, they mostly, because they are benefiting or they're getting some good of it, advantage from it, the common advantage, they uh, 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 will mostly agree, right? Because until it harms them or they feel that they're the enemy and they don't have affection, they hate each other and they no longer feel affection for each other and they see themselves as two cities, then that's something different. There is this idea that this is not imperial rule. Imperial rule or master is like a mastery. There is something about empire that is not political. Empire is a mastery in that sense. Whether he says that, um, in other words, investigate this matter, the function of one expert to be able to discern how to exercise political rule over the nearby, whether they wish to do or not. So that yes, there's going to be something interesting here. That there is something that there's going to be even those who engage investigate the matter that this should be the function of one who expert politics to be able to discern how to exercise political rule of those whether they wish it or not. This idea that you have to do it. This question to do that: does political rule involve some level of mastery? And that's a good question because it might require this. Why? Because of the unwilling, the unjust. The those who are unjust and bad or dangerous. Those who are dangerous. Those who aren't going to consent. Those who are not good and they want more. They don't want merely want what the common advantage. They want more than their share. They don't want to accept what the rules are. They don't see their other. They don't think that they should be treated as in an equal fashion or in the way they're achieving the good. That they deserve a greater share, or more, and the other people deserve less or nothing, and that they will not consent to this, and they will want to seek to overthrow, to disobey, to take, the cause, thieves, crooks, those who do it, or people who wish to harm. Right? Well, in other words, because there are bad people who are not going to consent or not going to follow the rules, not going to agree to what was decided. Well, you have to use coercion on these people. Right? That's where the coercion emerges. So therefore, this is that weird thing here in this sense, right? How could this be characteristic of political or legislative expertise when it is not even lawful, right? It is not lawful to rule a city in this fashion justly, let alone unjustly, and it is possible to conquer others unjustly. Now, in other words, contrary to those who equate, who equate might equals right, all the way back to chapter 1:6. That might does not equal right. That you're going to have a problem here, right? He raises this question that it is not lawful to rule a city in this fashion, justly, as a master, to rule a city, let alone unjustly, right? It is possible to conquer others unjustly, and it is possible to conquer others unjustly. This is done. Yet, not even in the other sciences do we see this. It is not a function of the doctor or the pilot to either persuade or compel persons to submit to their rule. Patients in the younger cases, voyagers in the other. In other words, the other arts. In other words, there's something about the other arts. The other arts, right? Not even the other science do we see this. In other words, that you have to compel somebody, right? That it is not the function of a doctor or pilot to persuade or compel persons to submit to their rule. Patients in the other one, converges in the other case. But most people seem to suppose that expertise in mastery and in political rule are the same thing, and they're not ashamed to practice they're not ashamed to practice in relation to others what they deny is just or advantageous for themselves. So therefore, this idea is that, in other words, there's a shamelessness. There's a shamelessness that we do this, and this may be the question of our relation to others, right? That we don't treat them as us, and we would treat them as inferior. So we will. There's a hypocrisy, he says, that these things are not the same. But for some reason, we assert we you treat them the same. Um, for among themselves they seek just rule, but they care nothing about justice towards others. Right. This is a very interesting point. Among themselves they will think just rule, but among others they think dominion. Right. That's the problem. Isn't that the criticism of foreign policy of cities? Isn't this the question of foreign policy in that sense? The city, when as regards to itself, often will talk about what is just, but in relationships to the other, the stranger, the neighbor, it is not that. Okay, it is rather they seek to dominate. Right. For among themselves they seek just rule, but they care nothing about justice towards others. It would be odd if there did not exist by nature. It would be odd if there did not exist by nature that which exercises mastery and that which does not exercise mastery. Okay, so it would be odd if there's those who exercise mastery, and so that if matters stand in this manner, one should not try to exercise mastery over all things, but only over those that are to be mastered. Right, just as one should not hunt human beings for feast or sacrifice, but rather that which is to be hunted for this purpose, namely any animal, wild animal, right? This whole idea. Now, this leads us back to that question of the natural slave, right? Okay, the reading despon twice in the manuscript rather than despoton, that which is to be mastered, and that which is not to be mastered, right? With the translation, so it is saying reading twice, desperon with the manuscript. Right? This is at 12. That those that exist by nature, that which exercise mastery, and that which does not exercise mastery, right? Um, This is something interesting. So that if the matter stands in this manner, one should not try to exercise mastery over things, but only over those things that are to be mastered. So that's okay. What is to be mastered? Okay, that is the question. This is what is suitable for masters. The question is, well, the unfree, the unfree, or the unjust. Those who are, in other words, that is the problem. Right? This is the distinction between the naturally. This is the naturally ruled and naturally ruling. Right. The whole discussion of the natural slave in Book One, and also the question of the natural ruler in the Pambasileia and at the end of Book Three, the dialogue in Pambasileia. There is something, and the problem of kingship being completely that it is exercise of rule, but it's an exercise of, but it has to be voluntary. In other words, can't no coercion tied to kingship. The second you act coercively, a monarchy ruler, the second he acts coercively, he's no longer a king; he's a tyrant. Um, so okay, so this is a very interesting point here. This idea that is there not by nature and exists a mastery by nature? Again, this leads us to the slave by nature that was discussed in Book One, right? But even a single city in isolation could be happy, which is to say, obviously engage in politics in a fine manner, a beautiful manner, if indeed it is possible for a city to be set in isolation somewhere using serious laws and organized and the organization of regime will not be with a view to war and conquering enemies for this is assumed not to exist. So we got this weird thing that he's going to suggest a city, a single isolated city, who doesn't have threat. They're not danger, not threat. See, the problem is if you have neighbors and they're hostile to you, or they endanger you, then you have to control them, right? You have to hunt them. You have to protect your people, right? And this creates the problem of aggression, right? Once you're if they are going to harm you, you have to prevent them from harming you, right? And your people, right? This leads to domination. The problem, therefore, this idea that there's going to be a conflict like this and domination and mastery is seen to be problematic. But what happens if you have a place that does not have domination, right? A city by itself. A city by itself where the threat of external enemies and external things are not there. And you can worry about ruling yourself finally. In other words, a city in isolation could be happy and obviously engage in politics in a beautiful manner. So, and what happens is that they can be the city is to be set in isolation somewhere and using serious laws, spudaion laws, and the organization of the regime will be not with a view to war and conquest of enemies, for this is assumed not to exist. But that's going to be, if you can get away with that, if the conditions are right, then that's fine. That is possible. But if you don't have the condition, that's a problem. So maybe the idea here is that the ideal is this isolation, but the reality is that's not going to happen. You're going to have places near you, and that therefore that's always going to be a threat. This is always going to be the danger that threatens just rule, the best regime. The best regime here is the regime that is we pray for. Therefore, there's not going to be the problem of war and the problem of threats, external threats and dangers. And therefore, you're isolated. It is the city in isolation. Like unlike the city in speech, where the conceptual city, here this city that we would pray for is going to be described as a city that is in isolation, and there's not neighbors that threaten it. It is clear, therefore, that all the pursuits that have to do with war ought to be regarded as beautiful, though not the highest end of all, but rather as being for the sake of that. Okay. In other words, so therefore war is beautiful. War is beautiful, in other words, kalon, noble, but it's not the highest thing. And the highest thing is happiness, right? The happiness of this and living beautifully. And that therefore the question is that in other words, war is a means to the end. War is not an end in itself. War is a means to achieve that allows you to still be happy. It is war and dealing with the enemy is not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. And what is the end? It is the living well, right? Living well. But living well is not acting mastery over everyone. It's this idea of there is this, unless there is a mastery, a natural mastery, and a natural master, and natural rulers, right? And then naturally ruled. But if that's not something that's natural in that sense, but rather there is, or it's not obviously said it is the case. Therefore, we have this idea of here, right? So he goes, it's not the highest, but rather as being for the sake of that. It belongs to the excellent, serious legislator to see how a city, the stock of human beings, in other words, the people, their race. The stock means their biology, their what they are, their character, their biology, their makeup, right? The people of human beings, and every other sort of community will share in the good life and in the happiness that is possible for them. So, what is this? The excellent, serious legislature is to see how a city and the people who are inhabiting it, right? Human beings, people who inhabit it, and every other sort of community, koinonia, will share in the good life and in the happiness that is possible for them. Some of the prescribed customs will vary, however, where neighboring peoples are present. It belongs to the legislature's expertise to see what sort of trainings are to be undertaken with a view to what sort of neighbors, and how the measures appropriate in each case are to be applied. So therefore, in other words, okay, the legislature needs to take care of it. What's your neighbors? The serious legislature needs to take at the character, people's character with this, and also the neighbors and their character. If the neighbors are peaceful and not threatening, you don't. There's no need for you to be worried about them, or you may have to curtail them in a relationship. But uh, but if they're dangerous, then and they're warlike and they're threatening, then you have to educate your people to address that. But also you have to moderate. In other words, if you know your people, if your people is going to be a warlike people, but your neighbors are not warlike, um, well, you need to maybe moderate the warlikeness, or unless you're going to act unjustly, you're going to be unjust. Okay. Um, but now this is how he ends the chapter. But this, towards what end the best regime should be directed, may be appropriately investigated later. Now, this is an interesting thing. 14, this is at chapter 7, 13 through 15, which book 7, 13, 14, and 15, the later chapters. So he's going to talk about this question here about what towards what end the best regime should be directed. Should be directed. What should the best regime direct towards? What kind of goal? What kind of justice it should seek? The end, the purpose, telos. This is going to be letter 13, 14, 15, right? Later. So okay, We stop here. Now we're going to end our chapter 2. It's a long chapter. Um, well, what is it there? You have any questions, comments? Please put them below. And if I see them, I'll respond to them. Please put some comments. This is a very thoughtful chapter. If you liked it, like it, share it with your friends, share it more. Um, um, if you didn't like it, say why, please. You can please tell me. I get feedback. It's good. Um, if you have not subscribed, please subscribe. If you want to, so that you can get future notifications and follow what's going on here. Encourage your friends to subscribe and grow the channel a little bit. Um, in other words, share this on social media. Share these things like this. Share it with emails to your friends. Spread the word, please. Spread the word. You can follow me on social media. The links are below. If you want to help, you want to contribute to this, me doing what I do this thing. Okay, I talk about this, and I'm not monetized yet. But if you see this later, years later, monetized, you can always, it's just when it becomes monetized, like this. But you can do that already through Patreon or Subscribestar. Right, current as I'm making this video, there's not many people doing. There's no one doing it anymore. I came late to this thing, and I really should do more. But another way you can help is to buy this book. You want to help me buy my 2022 book. This is a notebook on Aristotle's politics, a workbook. It is a kind of study guide, a Cliff's Notes on the politics. It goes chapter by chapter, book by book, and it gives kind of outlines, highlights, charts on how guiding you through reading the politics. It's a good handy a tool, and it'll be assessing for a student or a scholar looking at the politics. This will find this thing very useful. And if you buy it through Lulu, the publisher, I get the book. I mean, if you can buy, they're available at Amazon, Barnes and Noble online stores, but they take their cut. Okay, you buy by Lulu, I get the store's cut. So please buy a copy if you're interested in this, or you know a student who'd like to have it, or studying the politics. It'd be worth having. Please get it. Um, that's it. Well, tomorrow, next time we meet, we will look at chapter 3. Okay. Well, take care and bye bye. Have a good day.